In 1945, Alfred Hitchcock contacted Cary Grant, at that time one of the biggest movie stars in the world, and he asked Cary Grant, "Would you like to play in a modern version of Hamlet?" Now, at this time, Grant was in his mid 40s, and he had made his reputation as a star primarily through playing in light comedies. He was especially skilled at what we now call the screwball comedy. We can think, of course, of Bringing Up Baby. We can also think of His Girl Friday. We can also think of The Awful Truth. So Grant was known for his grace, his elegance, his wit, his cleverness, his quirkiness, his occasional eccentricity, his handsomeness. Not the sort of actor that you would think of if you wanted to make a film version of Hamlet in 1945. And again, we have to keep in mind his age, mid 40s. Hamlet, as he's imagined in Shakespeare's play, is around 30 years old. Well, Grant passed. He said, first of all, given my accent, and his accent was indeed unique, strange, inimitable, he said, given my accent, I don't think I could master the early modern diction I would need to in order to act Shakespeare well. And he also said, Hitch, I'm just too old. So it didn't happen. And we can lament that, perhaps, that we didn't get to see Cary Grant, one of the great actors of his age. Indeed, some would argue, and I would agree, some would argue the greatest movie actor ever. It would have been great to see him play Hamlet. It would have been fantastic to see Hitchcock direct him in Hamlet. Well, Hitchcock did direct Grant again more than once. He directed him again a year later in 1946, Notorious. He had early directed Grant in 1941 in Suspicion. Now, what Hitchcock understood about Grant, and he also understood this about Jimmy Stewart, I might add. What he understood about Grant is that behind that wonderful cinematic mask he had created for himself, underneath there was a very troubled man. And Hitchcock was able to bring out of Grant this tension between the smooth, suave Cary Grant and Archie Leach. Archie Leach is Cary Grant's birth name, and Cary Grant went by Archie Leach until he got to Hollywood. And Archie Leach had a very difficult life. He was brought up poor. He, most tragically, lost his mother at a very young age. Archie Leach's father was having an affair with another woman and wanted to be with that woman. And instead of undergoing the difficulty, the ignominy, the legal proceedings of a divorce, he arranged for Archie's mother to be taken to an insane asylum. He had her committed. Men could do that in those days. And that's what happened. Archie comes home from school one day, I think he's 11, and his dad says, "Oh, your mom's just gone." She's gone. She's gone away. So all of his life until adulthood, when he finally discovered what happened, Archie/Cary thought that his mom had abandoned him. Grew up poor, not totally impoverished, but just definitely not financially comfortably necessarily. Lost his mother in this tragic way and quit school, got into acrobatics, theater, and eventually Archie makes his way to America and takes the name Cary Grant and becomes Cary Grant. So what Hitchcock does in Notorious and what he does in Suspicion is he shows us a Cary Grant who is attractive, suave, but there's something really dark underneath the mask. Something unseemly, evil, we might even say. In Suspicion, it's thought for much of the film that Grant's character, Johnny Aisgarth, is a murderer. And the character in Notorious, Devlin, has a vexed relationship to the Ingrid Bergman character. He loves her, but because he, as a spy, has basically to arrange for her to marry a Nazi to infiltrate this Nazi ring in Brazil, he essentially is whoring her out. That's how he sees it. So he loves her, but yet he loathes her because she's basically cheating on him by marrying another man. It's extremely complicated. And he becomes misogynistic and dark and cruel at times. So what I'm saying is that what Hitchcock understood about Grant is that Grant's identity is extremely complicated. There's a definite split in his psyche between the depressive Archie Leach and the bright character Cary Grant. And Grant had serious mental health issues throughout his life. He struggled with alcoholism. He struggled with depression. In the 50s, he underwent LSD treatment. He would take LSD and lie on a couch while under the influence talk for hours to a psychiatrist. And then he and the psychiatrist would go through this script to try to figure out what was ailing this man. So, given Hitchcock's understanding of Grant as a man who is split between two identities, if not 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 identities, I think this is why he thought, oh, well, he could play Hamlet. Because that is Hamlet's problem throughout the play. To be or not to be, obviously, is a meditation on suicide most overtly, but that soliloquy and others suggest that Hamlet's biggest problem is, who am I? Who's there? Who's there? That's how the play opens. Who's there? And so we constantly see Hamlet and we say, who's there? Who are you, Hamlet? Are you mainly a scholar? Are you a courtier? Are you a lover of Ophelia? Are you a soldier? Do you want to be a good son to your mother? Do you want to be a good son to your father? Are you going to be a vengeful murderer of your father's killer? Are you sane? Are you insane? Are you in control? Are you not in control? And really, it's only at the end of the play, when Hamlet stops trying to make plans to control events, that he has a better understanding of who he is. When he sees the funeral of Ophelia, he appears and says, I have more right to mourn this young woman than you do, Laertes, her brother. And they start to fight, and he says, it is I, Hamlet the Dane. As if Hamlet only kind of grasps his identity when he stops trying so hard to grasp his identity. Hamlet's a tragedy. Soon after he has this revelation, he dies along with everybody else, basically. So, did Hitchcock actually end up making a Hamlet with Cary Grant in it? Well, the answer is obviously yes. In 1859, 1959, I'm writing a biography of Walt Whitman right now, so I'm living in the 19th century. In 1959, Hitchcock directs North by Northwest, starring Cary Grant. And this is the modern version of Hamlet. And Cary Grant, given his own history, perfectly suited to play this modern version of Hamlet. Now, the title North by Northwest, it comes from Shakespeare's Hamlet. When Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, his friends, ask him, hey, Hamlet, are you really insane? You're acting pretty weird. He says, I am but mad north by northwest. When the wind is southerly, I know a hawk from a handsaw. In other words, I'm just sort of pretending to be mad. I can choose to know what is true and what is not true, what is real and what is not real when I want to. But for Hitchcock to call his film North by Northwest, he's clearly alluding to the Shakespeare line from Hamlet, but also he's saying there's a kind of madness in this film. Hitchcock himself said one reason he used this title was because the whole film's a fantasy. there is no north by northwest on a compass, just as there is no reality in this film. Well, that's a bit hyperbolic, but it shows us that the film is less about the importance of plot, though it has a very rip-roaring plot, and it's more about what goes on in someone's mind, what is fantastical and what is not fantastical. There are other reasons the film was called North by Northwest. That's the direction that the main character, Roger Thornhill, takes from New York, South Dakota. Eventually, the film was meant to end in Alaska. It didn't end in South Dakota at Mount Rushmore. So let's think about this film, North by Northwest. What's the first scene of the film? We see in New York City a huge mirrored building where the windows are mirrors, and we see the cars rushing by underneath, but basically we see not what's happening, we see what's happening in the mirror. We see reflections. So already we're put in a world where we're meant to ask, well, what's more real? The reflection in the glass or the actual things? The reflection in the glass in this opening shot is shimmery, beautiful, and utterly enticing, entrancing even. The mirror seems more intriguing than what the mirror is actually reflecting. Now, it's interesting in this context to note that the main character, played by Cary Grant, is, in his real life, named Roger Thornhill, and he is an ad executive. And what do advertising executives do? But they try to create images that make products more desirable than they really are. They essentially do to the world what this mirrored building is doing to the street around it, turning something ordinary into a simulacrum of itself, which seems more interesting than what is actually being imitated. Now, it's time to pause right here and cite two really interesting lines that Cary Grant gave out in interviews. I wrote them down. I want to get them right. Grant once said, "To play yourself, your true self, is the hardest thing in the world." To play yourself, your true self, is the hardest thing in the world. Now, this sounds odd. Obviously, we tend to think that, no, when I'm being my real self, I'm being authentic. I'm not playing a role. But Grant's saying, no, yourself, your best self, your true self, is a role that you create. And the goal is to act that role well, to live into that role. Almost as if he's saying, put a mask on of who you want to be and then live into that mask and become that person represented by that mask. And connected to this quote is another where he says, everybody wants to be Cary Grant. Even I want to be Cary Grant. Making it very clear that Cary Grant is a mask. It's a persona of a kind of man who is extremely desirable to other men. Everyone wants to be like Cary Grant. Again, the grace, the wit. He's debonair. He's a movie star. But the sense that Cary Grant is a construct. So we might say that Archie Leach created the role Cary Grant. And obviously in movies, Archie Leach plays into that role, Cary Grant. In what we might even call real life, he plays into that role, Cary Grant, and becomes Cary Grant. So, what we are faced with in the very early moments of North by Northwest is that a mask can be more real than a real face. If that mask brings forth potentialities, virtues, powers that would not be brought forth without the mask. Now we can boil this down to a silly cliche that's often used in cognitive behaviorism, cognitive behavioralist therapy. Fake it till you make it. If your life's not going like you want it to be, create habits, create roles that you think would make your life better and live into those roles. So here is what North by Northwest is basically about. Roger Thornhill. He's an ad man. From the first 10 minutes of the film, we see he doesn't have a very fulfilled life. He's been divorced a couple times. He has a female friend, and he's in the house with her. He tells his secretary, "I'll send her some candy and flowers." Very, very perfunctory. Clearly doesn't love this woman very much. He's very vain, concerned about his appearance. He says to his secretary, "Do I look heavy? Do I look thick? Put on my desk a little note that says, 'Think thin.'" He is going to play with his mother, and he doesn't want to be around his mother at all. She's a very controlling sort of mother. He's going to have 3 martinis before going to the play. In other words, he's not a very satisfied man. And then suddenly, he is mistaken by these henchmen for George Kaplan, who is thought to be a spy. And he is taken into custody by these men. And for the rest of the film, he is treated by the villain, played by James Mason, as if he is a spy. And first of all, James Mason, Roger Townsend, tries to kill George Kaplan. He fails. And then he's able to frame George Kaplan for a murder he didn't commit. Meanwhile, an American agent who's also a spy, Eve Kendall, played by Eva Marie Saint, is trying to help George Kaplan survive. They fall in love. Eventually, Roger Thornhill likes being George Kaplan. George Kaplan becomes a kind of mask that he lives into. And his life becomes much more exciting, much more interesting, much more meaningful as George Kaplan. So this is his Hamlet. He is searching the entire film for an identity. Who am I? Who's there? And by the end, he is George Kaplan. Now, interestingly, the very last scene, he and Kendall are going to, they're married, and he calls her Miss Roger Thornhill. So he reasserts that earlier moment, that earlier identity, just as he and Kendall are going to go to bed together. They're in a train. The train goes through a tunnel, very phallic, very sexual. But it's a moment of, male potency. Because this is a comedy, meaning that, in a comedy, everybody gets what they deserve. In a very crass way, we can say that's what a comedy is, as opposed to a tragedy where people suffer more than they deserve. Hamlet perhaps deserves to suffer, but not as much as he does. North by Northwest is a comedy. So we could say that by the end, Roger Thornhill has learned to synthesize his old identity with his new identity. And there's no sense of a split between the two, an uncomfortable rift, as Grant himself experienced in his own life, probably, an uncomfortable rift between Cary Grant and Archie Leach. So North by Northwest is a kind of fantasy. It's a fantasy of achieving a synthesis between the self you want to be and the self that you've been given. And when I say the self that you've been given, I mean the self that you've been given by, say, your DNA, that you've been given by where you grew up, that you've been given by who your parents are, so on and so forth. All the factors that have shaped you into who you are right now, that's the self that you've been given. The self you want to be, one might say, that's where you practice your agency. You imagine the self you want to be, and you create a role or a mask. You live into that. Most of us go our whole lives struggling in between those two polarities. But the fantasy of North by Northwest, the comedy, shows that fantasy fulfilled, where the given self and the imagined self synthesize beautifully, and the debonair man ends up with the gorgeous woman. So that is Hitchcock's Hamlet, starring Cary Grant. Explores the same themes as Hamlet in a modern setting, but by the end ultimately turns Hamlet the tragedy into Hamlet the comedy.